So, a very good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the fourth edition of the IIMA Public Policy Alumni Special Interest Group webinar series. We have, as we've shared earlier, the IIMA Public Policy ASIG is a group of alumni and faculty of the Institute with expertise and interest in the fields of public policy and development. It aims to foster collaboration among IIMA community, faculty, students, and alumni, and the wider world of public policy practitioners to contribute to India's inclusive development agenda. The webinar series itself aims to bring the thoughts, views, and expertise of renowned experts to the IIMA community. The webinars are structured as a dialogue between two eminent speakers, the invited guest, and IIMA faculty, and we do take input as well. Today's topic is about technology-led growth and how policy, business, and academia can collaborate better. To share his views on this very important issue, it is a privilege to welcome Professor K. VijayRaghavan, Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. Professor VijayRaghavan has earlier served as Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, Government of India during January 2013 to January 2018. Until then, he was the Director of National Center for Biological Sciences, Bengaluru, where he continues as a distinguished professor. We also have with us Professor Rakesh Basant, Professor of Economics, Dean-Alumni and External Relations, and JSW Chair, Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at IIM Ahmedabad. To all the participants, please send in your questions in the Q&A section. Professor Basant will pick a few from it and address it to Professor VijayRaghavan. Now, I hand over the platform to Professor Basant to take over to the proceedings.
Thank you, Anurag. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Vijay, today and on a topic which is of great interest to me personally. I've been working on it, and we have been doing a variety of things around this theme. I have a few questions, but I will talk about those questions after your initial remarks. I just want to mention that today's discussion is particularly important in the context of the new education policy, because a lot of things which are at least mentioned there are in line with some things which people who work in this area of technology, strategy, and how business policies and academia should come together have been talking about. So I look forward to hearing you, Vijay, and I'm sure we will have a lot of questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with all of you today. It's of course, the last several months have been unreal compared to what the previous years were. And it also gives us a different perspective of how our communication has changed dramatically. We think very rapidly, we have adjusted to think that these forms of communication on the teleconferences and webinars are perfectly normal and just the thing to do, instead of traveling and talking to people in auditoriums and so on and so forth. But this new normal, as it were, has had much deeper impact. And of course, the world has had similar upheavals many, many times to human civilization. Disasters, wars, pandemics have all been there. But this seems to be special for a variety of reasons. So what I'll do very briefly, try to say why we are likely in a truly special situation, and why, therefore, we must look to go ahead in truly different ways. Now, why are we in a truly special situation? The answer to that comes in terms of, where we came from, both in terms of humans and in our industrial growth till now. And that growth and that change on our planet has woven an interaction between policy, politics, economics, science and technology, and industry, and our society in a manner where this intricate binding was something we were given. So till last year, whenever we spoke about what we need to do, we spoke in the context of these boundary conditions as if they were um, always there, and we will always be there. So our challenge as countries or as industries was to negotiate landscapes which we didn't think would be subject to such dramatic change. With the pandemic, there has been a rather dramatic change in these boundary conditions. Global supply chains have been broken, markets have been disrupted, and there is scope for potentially a new order to come in place. Of course, there's no chance of that new order to come in place unless those who want such an order do something about it. Otherwise, the same old order will come back. So the question before us is, do we want change in the way we function on this planet, or do we want it to be business as usual? And one of the big concerns I have is with the way people in industry, industrialists, the big consultancy groups, and so on, look at the way our planet is and how change will take. They look at it substantially from a business and economics perspective. How will GDP grow? Who will have what kinds of markets? Which are the economies which are rising, which are falling? And they seem to be agnostic to what the state of the planet otherwise is. You know, what's happening to the environment, what's happening to quality of life, what's happening to issues such as global warming, what's happening to biodiversity. And the reason for that is a good one, which I'll address, good in quotes, one, which I'll address very briefly. And that is that we have been addicted to an idea of progress, which looks at the maximum return for the minimum cost. And in maximizing that return and minimizing the cost, we have basically passed on the costs of damage to our environment and to our planet to future generations. And therefore, we are able to get so-called quality for a much cheaper price than otherwise it would cost. It is now time for us to reformat our economics so that we pay for the future now. That's of course going to be difficult. Many economists have analyzed this and they have suggested different start dates now, next year or 10 years later. The pandemic has shown us that we have to factor in our costs to our world right now. So the question then comes, who will bear those costs? Unless we as people learn to have mechanisms to bear those costs, we're going to be in trouble. So let's very quickly go through how we came about here. So if you look at those who portend to predict the future, these are interestingly called historians of the future. In the old days, they used to be called astrologers. These people analyze our past and tell us which way we are going. And their view, most of them were very, they had, they portended doom. In their view, humans have, till a few thousand, tens of thousands of years ago, had to deal with the dice which nature rolled out. And whichever way that happened, we had to deal with it. But what has happened over human history is that humans have learned how to engineer nature in such a manner that they loaded the dice in their favor, in our favor, in humans' favor. And the result is that we could withstand nature's dice in a manner which was biased in our favor. This was because we could engineer nature. And therefore the mysteries of Prithvi, Jal, Vayu, Akash, Agni, the oceans, the air, skies, and energy were seemingly ours and only ours to understand. And in doing so, we have become stewards of the planet and nature's engineers. And for a variety of reasons, the future of the planet is in our hands. How did this come about? You can look at our origins and see how that happened. It was through a series of accidents, major events which periodically destroyed many forms of life on Earth. The most recent one was an asteroid crashing onto Earth 65 million years ago. That led to the extinction of the animals which dominated the planet at that time, dinosaurs, and to the rise of the mammalian radiation, so that mammals then soon started dominating. That led to our evolution. This has been recounted beautifully by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and people, geneticists, have shown that all life on Earth, which has it has a common origin, is connected by a common chemistry through the thread of DNA. And by understanding this genetic material, as we have done now, we've not only understood how, to great extent, how all life on Earth has developed. There are many mysteries still to be unraveled, and that will keep on being there. But we've also begun to understand how we as humans came about. And we as humans came about by multiple accidents of evolution, multiple other accidents of evolution, where our brains developed disproportionately large to our body size compared to our other non-human primate relatives. And there are multiple reasons for that. We have the ability of speaking. We have the ability of opposing thumb and forefinger. So all of this has led to us becoming engineers of this planet. So that's been quite extraordinary. And as has been said by many people, most beautifully by Dan Dennett, a neurophilosopher, well, actually quoting someone else, Kawa McCready, he said that, 10,000 years ago, human population, plus our livestock and our pets, was about 0.1% of terrestrial vertebrate biomass. Today, our pets, our livestock, and ourselves account for 98% of vertebrate biomass. So over billions of years on this unique sphere, chance had painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. And suddenly we humans have grown in population and technology and intelligence, and I'll tell you why when you have some time, to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush on the planet. Now, we have done extraordinary things in terms of our ability to wield power as engineers. And one of the most notable was on July 16th, 1945, when at 5:29 a.m., the atomic bomb was exploded in Trinity site at New Mexico. And that leaves a lasting imprint on this planet. But even before that, before the First World War, a group of Germans, Haber and Bosch, invented the Haber-Bosch process to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. This allowed us to make fertilizer, and this book by Thomas Hager, which describes that, called The Alchemy of Air. So we could get nitrogen from the air and make fertilizer. Until then, fertilizer was got as guano, bird shit, as it were, or by nitrite mines, which were running out. But the ability to fix nitrogen allowed the massive increase in agriculture so that food was no longer limited. You could grow anything you wanted. You could feed that to animals. You could feed that to humans. And therefore, human beings were not limited by food. And that was a dramatic change. And the result of that is today, about half the nitrogen in each of us comes from the Haber-Bosch process. Now that and a variety of other technologies, such as the steam engine, mining, and so on, resulted in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and many further industrial revolutions. And as a result of that, we have the planet as it is today. But a characteristic of that kind of development is the generation of extraordinary wealth, order, clean environments, and high quality of life in pockets around the world, at the expense of not having all of this in other parts of the world or other parts of your own country in other pockets. In other words, you've got a mechanism of greatly reducing entropy, creating order in parts of our societies all over the world at the expense of disorder outside. And this has resulted in the world we have today, where greenhouse gases, the loss of biodiversity, poverty, disparity, and so on are considered the norm. And this was what we had till December 2019, where we thought that how do we go away from that given all the boundary conditions we had. But that's now changed rather dramatically today with the pandemic. And so we have a new way of looking at it. So how do we go from here? There are some dramatic changes which have taken place over the last decade, which allow a different view of how we can go ahead. And I will allude to three of them in the context of the opportunities we have. The first one, which many had been speaking about till last year, was the domination, the potential domination of the tools of artificial intelligence and learning. Many thought that those discussions were hype. Many thought that those discussions centered around a genuine danger of two kinds of danger. One, a sharpening of divide of wealth, so that through the tools of artificial intelligence and the collection of data, we had few corporations which would be dominating the world, and everyone else would be told very, very effectively on what is good for them. The analysis of data and the use of that to predict the next step would go down to the finest level of granularity, where you could be told in a very informative and positive manner what's good for you, and you would then listen to that, and this brave new world would effectively reduce your capacity for free will and deciding what you want to do. That extreme situation aside, this has already entered many aspects of our lives in the way our extended intelligence, as it were, to the devices we use and the links to the web in multiple ways are very closely involved in our decision making. What does this portend for those in countries such as ours, where we have a large amount of data, but correspondingly low amount of empowerment in the use of that data, right? So that's something which we need to consider. But more fundamentally, to answer that, we need to see how data is used in society more and more, and how going out of this pandemic it will be valuable. Very simply, data and computing and AI needs to go through society in different ways. And the questions of how machines are involved in that is a problem which started in 1950, posed by Alan Turing, about whether machines can think, in his beautiful paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which is actually something which is so simply written, it's worth everyone's read. Now, the key question which Turing posed was that, in answer to his question, can machines think, was the development of AI effectively, which aims to simulate human intelligence or replicate it in machines. And that's too general a definition of AI. But the most specific definition of AI was by two people, Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, who called AI as the study of agents that receive percepts from the environment and perform actions. And this more pragmatic definition of AI allows us to design machines which will effectively do routine things and see and develop machines which can aim to develop humanly, think rationally, act humanly, and act rationally. And this is something which is more and more feasible in terms of what is called narrow AI or weak AI. The more general AI or the artificial general intelligence, where machines behave in every way like humans, is considered a bit far away now for us. So let's look at narrow AI and what that means to us in the world. That narrow AI is hinged on big data, and we often talk about the value of data in our decision making on a large. But we must keep in mind that there's a long way between data to what we do through AI. And that's where our challenge is for countries like India, new situation. Data is, of course, the fodder for AI, but this is not an apt metaphor. Given oil of fodder, um, is not sufficient. Raw data is next to, with oil or fodder, you know what to do, but with raw data, you don't know what to do. So it's actually raw data is next to useless in individual hands. It needs to get together in a collective. But data is not information. So from data, we need to get information. Information processing and annotating data is important. Information is not knowledge. We need to get knowledge from that information. And that knowledge is necessary for understanding. And that understanding itself is not sufficient for machines to take decisions. Quite often, lateral inputs and lateral thinking is critically important for us to take decisions. And one of my favorite examples is that of Jocelyn Bell, who looked at the data which led to proposing pulsars, and very easily a machine at that time could have looked at those unusual patterns and attributed it to noise and thrown it away. But she made a leap of faith through understanding. That is necessary for reasoned action, and that's something which still is in the realm of artificial general intelligence, which we don't have. So from a big data perspective, we have the following challenge. And I'd like to end with that we're going to have increasingly in this new world coming out, the value of data coming in again for two reasons. One, the supply chains would require that data to be dealt with. Secondly, manufacturing will go back from being at sites of cost arbitrage and labor arbitrage to sites where the products are being used. So a combination of these two means you're going to have big data and design and machine learning involved in designing each of the components used in a manufacturing process. These would be tested out locally and manufactured locally. And high resolution designs would be where value comes from, and those designs will be exported. That will be the principal R&D export to other locations where large-scale manufacturers will take. So what is the mechanism by which we could get continued value for that design, whether it is a shoelace or a semiconductor chip or a radio telescope with all its components, materials, everything done and tested and prototyped at location, and then the design exported. So this is going to be an enormous R&D export value, and that's where a country such as India with substantial investment in training quality people can keep going ahead. Not an escape into a computer science oriented approach to an economy, because you will have to have local manufacturing to prototype and test things out. But this is going to be, if done well, ranging from every aspects of our lives, from textiles to computers, a design focus could be transformative for the economy. And some of my colleagues and I have been discussing this on how to take this forward. The second aspect of manufacturing and design and AI is going to be on people. With all these becoming the ways by which our economies will grow, what is it that is going to drive our economic growth in a large population with many young people? If you are in a rural area and you want to buy your mobile phone or your electric car and so on and so forth, you cannot pay for that only with your farm products. So you must have manufacturing also in rural areas to pay for that. And this design-oriented manufacturing is one way to do that. If you go, for example, to several small Swiss villages, you will find cows and farming and dairying and so on and so forth. But you will also very likely find a big barn where the most intricate manufacturing of some parts or the other in a niche manner exported to anywhere in the world takes place. That model is now feasible in a combination of physical manufacturing for India too. The revolutions which have led to the availability of electric power everywhere, and I won't go into that, combined with the revolutions in the power transistor, which allow motors to be driven at low voltage and therefore allow manufacturing of various kinds to take place and devices of various kinds to be powered, means that niche manufacturing of various kinds of high-tech products can take place in a distributed manner. When you combine that with the learning of computer science and coding on scale in a language agnostic manner, then you also empower people so that they are not disenfranchised by the accumulation of power through the analysis of data of big companies. So that is the direction which we need to take. So in summary, big data is going to be very important and is not to be poo-pooed away. But for us to be empowered as opposed to disempowered by big data, we must take the opportunity for connecting our people at every level to the most recent of technology. And that, for a strange set of circumstances, is today feasible. And therefore, we must ensure that we can connect India with Bharat in a big way and bring into the workforce 50% of our population, namely women, on a scale as never before. So science and technology is going to be very, very important. Whether you're looking through a telescope or a microscope, these instruments are very important. But what is most important is what lies 6 inches behind the eyepiece of a complex instrument, i.e. our brains. If we use that and train our citizens to understand the current challenges in economic opportunity, then the world is ours. If we miss that, no amount of fancy equipment or low-end services will justify the potential success which our population has. So I'd like to stop here and take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay, for this very fascinating broad brush, all-encompassing kind of starting the discussion. I have several questions, but I'll start with the broadest one first. I mean, as you pointed out right in the beginning, businesses are typically short-termish and they look at economic efficiency. And that has driven us in a variety of ways over the years. And now we are, as you mentioned, at a cusp where we can take a different kind of path, so to say. And availability of certain technologies and data allow us to start thinking about it actively. Now, given the fact that most decisions about what technology to use, what data to collect, what do you do with that data, and what questions to ask with that data are essentially decided either by the policymakers, who are typically politicians, or by the business people who are looking for their immediate business interests. Or if one wants to do some blue sky stuff, academics can come in, but academics can also be quite short-termish. Now, given the fact that all the three groups of people who are engaged in doing something at this point in time, whether they are in academia or policy making or in industry, they do not have long-term perspectives typically. Academics may have, but not always. How does one manage to do things which you are asking us to do, empower people, use the data in the right fashion and things like that? Can we think of simple initiatives which can sort of nudge us in that direction?
The answer to this very difficult question is simple, but the solution is complex. I'd like to distinguish between the answer and the solution. Answer is something which doesn't worry about feasibility and implementation, and solutions worry about the practical situation and therefore are approximate. But the answer is simple, that we need to have a clarity in goals as a community of all these different pillars, policymakers, economists, scientists, engineers, politicians, and so on. If that clarity in goals are there, then we'll be able to find all the means to take our goals to fruition. If the goals are fuzzy, no matter how good you are in each of the means, you're not going to manage to go somewhere, right? Now, how do we get a clarity in goals? So one possibility is, from our perspective, that we have enabling rules and regulations and laws which stimulate the growth of data and its use in a society beneficial manner. So our domination of the AI space should be focused on agriculture, health, education, environment, and so on. In other words, as a result of that, there is a substantial government involvement and support, both in terms of direct funding and enabling situations. But this becomes the area, and once an area of growth becomes a common good, there was hopefully a new bonding and a new way of intertwining all these verticals. You're muted, Rakesh.
What you're saying is absolutely correct, that given the situation today, if you want to move towards certain goals which require empowerment and common good, the state will have to come in a significant manner, because market failures are significantly high. But at the same time, people like me also fear about government failures, right? I mean, it's a what kind of so instead of discussing it at a more abstract level, you probably are one of the very few people in the country who has tried to do certain things, whether it was the BIPP program, you have been associated with BIRI as well, and you have been part of basic research, and you've also been part of applied research. Now, all these solutions or things that we are talking about will have to be a combination of basic research as well as applied research. Can you think of a particular initiative which you thought was very promising and one should sort of enlarge that, pick that up, and apply it more widely?
I think, no, this is a very important point. And one of the lessons from the pandemic is that it has shown us that we don't have to be constrained by previous experience alone. Indeed, it has forced us to have new solutions to complex problems, independent of previous experience. Let me give you an example, two examples from the pandemic. One is about testing for the presence of the virus. Global supply chains before testing was ramped up required you to import entire test kits or components of the test kit. And now that has changed dramatically with massive manufacturing of test kits, including the synthesis of reagents and so on. Now, that poses an enormous strain, but this happened because our national laboratories, our industry, public support, government support all came together. And many people involved in this were not even thinking of going along these lines. So hold that for one. The other is, take something like ventilators and personal protective equipment. India was very low or nowhere in this manufacturing scale of those. And again, many companies and individuals and entrepreneurs repurposed to do this. These two examples highlight two lessons. One, that there is a potential for partnership and taking on opportunity. India can now, for example, be a frugal development of tests for the entire world, and making PPE for the entire world if it gets its act together fast. So both for India and the world, that is certainly. But it highlights a more fundamental issue which links basic science to application, which is if you leave aside the sensory part could be agriculture, human health, or animal health, or education. And if you leave aside the action part, which feeds back into these areas, in between, you have the analysis of information and decision making there. So whether it is a diagnostic for a human, or a diagnostic for an animal, or a diagnostic for an industry, or the environment, that information processing inside is the same, therefore allowing you to repurpose one, the central theme, for anything else, with these periphery being important. Which is not to say that our deep understanding of the periphery is not necessary. It isn't necessary. You need a veterinarian or a doctor or an air pollution expert and so on. But there's an enormous opportunity for this middle to come together in our space in completely new ways, different from what we have done earlier. And that opportunity needs to be grasped by our basic science institutes, our management institutes, and everyone else, working together in clusters in Ahmedabad, Pune, Bangalore, Delhi, so that there's a shared common purpose which drives us.
So what you're saying is that this crisis has created opportunities and some kind of models wherein policymakers, academics, and industry people can potentially come together, and that might give us some future direction.
You know, what puzzles me is how seamlessly people came together during the pandemic.
Right.
They didn't have to be dragged, kicked, and screaming. Whereas before, if you keep on exhorting them, it was a tough job. Now, will this rubber band, which has been stretched, when released, go back to its old state, or will it stay in this stretched state? Difficult to say, but certainly it's a situation which we must use to demonstrate the value. The value of working together has been demonstrated, and now we must, ensure that it stays.
So, suppose we create certain kinds of models and people sort of learn from these kinds of opportunities. At a larger level, what kind of changes would be required to multiply these kinds of experiments? Will that require significant change in the education system? We have just got a new education policy. Or would it require significant changes in the incentive structures for the industry people, or some kind of broader guidelines for the policymakers?
Well, I think all of these changes are necessary, they're very important. But the biggest change which both India and the world needs is a de-addiction to frugal but really high-tech, high-quality goods. What has happened in the last decade or two is because of the dominance of China in global supply chains and making products all over the world, elites in countries such as India have been addicted to quality of life altering goods at a very low price. This is unnatural. Fundamentally, it is an addiction which has led to us not being able to think originally, to go forward and be inventive in a more sustainable manner, for the reasons I alluded right at the beginning of my talk. So this breaking of global supply chains is a wake-up call. It's not that your fancy phone is a bad thing to have, but can you pay for it? And can you pay for it in a manner where you are also contributing something to the manufacture of this in an environmentally sustainable manner? That is feasible, but this de-addiction is the principal goal we must pursue while we attend to education or agriculture or health and so on. Otherwise, what will happen is you will get into the same trap again. You will say, I need to take health to all. And therefore, in that urgency, you will say, the cheapest way of doing this is to buy A, B, and C from one client, one vendor. And you back into the trap again and again. Why should you do anything at all when it's available more cheaply from outside.
Sure, sure, sure.
So we must have a cultural reappropriation of our goals if we have to do anything in any of these sectors.
So I have a couple of other questions, but let me take some questions from the audience. So one question is, what are the reasons that the hard experience of COVID-19 will make the governments and politicians see the threat of climate change differently and take action, something that they have not done so far, not even since COVID-19 has started?
See, the fundamental issues on climate change and the environment, he tends to, ask governments to do something or the other without ourselves being a part of solutions, right? So in other words, we set wrong boundary conditions. We want these big problems to be solved in a manner which doesn't affect us and our lifestyle at all, right? Now, when you do that, you're forcing governments, which we elect, into having only a certain narrow bandwidth where solutions can operate. So unless policymakers, governments, citizens, industry share a common sense of purpose, and a country the size of India, if it shares a common purpose for the planet, can have an enormous impact. We are not Liechtenstein, right, where a common purpose may not have a global impact. So we must recalibrate our demands of government and not just say, can you do this? But here's how we can work together to do this. A lot of that is happening. Only then it will stay. Otherwise, experience from previous global disasters over several thousand years have shown that memory for those is fairly short.
So there is similar question. How can politics resistant science policy be instituted?
This comes from a natural but misplaced view that politics is somehow bad. Politics resistant science policy will come about if we roll up our sleeves and get involved in matters of science administration, matters of administration in general, if scientists stand for elections and get involved and look at the complexities. Then there's a potential for creating, what this question is very important, creating a middle space where no matter what your views, one end of the spectrum or the other, certain things are standard and need to be done. And the bureaucracy gets oiled into doing that because these are not negotiable. These things have happened in some of our contexts in primary education, women's health, the Anganwadis, the Asha workers, and so on. Those have become standardized. So every layer of the pyramid, which is delivering for public good, should have that robustness so that the room for ideological movement across is not a roller coaster ride, but a steady going in one direction or another, depending on what the country's demands are and what we elect our leaders to do. That's feasible, but it requires a greater involvement on our part.
That's to me, that's a big statement. You're saying that middle space exists and a rational policy can coexist with political rhetoric.
Oh yeah. My favorite example is of many decades ago, where you had Italy changing a government a week while it was at simultaneously an economic power. But those extreme situations we don't need or don't want to have by any means. We have today a government which has a substantial majority, and this is a good time, therefore, to put in place mechanisms where this sensible middle ground is occupied, irrespective of where one is. That's what we must aim to do. Put in policy and structural changes which are not completely born out of every form of compromise, so that the goals are fuzzy. Goals need to be clarified, and the means then will become clear.
So there is another question which I had indirectly asked earlier about incentives for industry. I just want to link it up to what you just said. You said that the current crisis has created interesting opportunities and people have seamlessly come together. If we don't want to lose this momentum and we want to take certain steps so that this continues and the momentum continues, and we are not only interacting around COVID-related issues, but other technology-related issues. And you have been doing a lot of stuff around projects like BIPP and SBIRI. What do you think would be a good incentive for industry to continue in this mode?
You know, there are two challenges which industry has.
Right.
And I will not restrict myself to any sector.
Sure.
One is in terms of industrial research and development. If you look at the amount of investment by, let's say, the Googles of the world in their internal R&D, it's more than the budget of the US National Science Foundation, right? So what chance does an Indian company have in, even if they were to invest in R&D, to compete with these behemoths, right? So that's one question which we need to answer. And that answer is simple and is doable. I think in our intellectual space, in our laboratories, in our think tanks, we have three things which can enormously mitigate industry risk in investing in R&D. Those three things are intellectual heft, infrastructure, and space. And therefore, every 1,000 rupees which industry invests in R&D can be made into 10,000 through partnership. So Indian industry must partner with Indian academia and startups and the general ecosystem to be truly innovative and therefore not try to climb out this wall of competition, but go through that in novel ways. That's feasible because, as I said earlier, the world has changed into a design-centric world. Therefore, intellect can drive exponential growth in very interesting ways. So risk mitigation is one area where industry can work. But even if you do that, unless government procurement and government investment is substantial, industry cannot scale. And that is so everywhere in the world. Nowhere in the world, most capitalist of societies have big industries grown without standing on the shoulders of government.
Sure.
And that is well articulated. We don't have to imitate what the West has done, but we can emulate certain kinds of principles, apply them to growth in sectors such as health, education, and agriculture. That will both transform our bottom level to higher levels where they can escape from poverty, but also have industry grow in these areas.
That's good that you said that. I had a question about, I saw your paper with Dutz on the World Bank one on BIPP and some other work subsequently. And I've been reading some literature in that space, and I thought that if initiatives like SBRI and BIPP are combined with government procurement, currently they are not, it's not mandated there. And on the other hand, provide some kind of support for commercialization, which is currently not there by tying up with incubation, then those kinds of projects potentially may have much more impact than what they've had so far. Do you agree?
Well, I'd like to throw back a question to this audience as a draft learning from the pandemic. I think we spent a lot of time in the past arguing that incentives for procurement, for commercialization will allow our industry to grow. There is a point there that can happen. But remember that we're also tied up to global market supply chains. And therefore, no matter how good your product is and what incentive you give, you have, let's say, a fantastic circuit and products done for, let's say, traffic light management all over the place, and you now want to apply to a tender from a municipal corporation, but you are now competing with the Honeywells of the world, right? Who will underbid you, that or a Chinese company or someone. How are you going to deal with that? So it's not just the product and the technology and the incentive and the procurement, but how are you going to value Indian products? Unfortunately, there are some sectors where this has become a national imperative. Telecom sector is one where design is very important. The semiconductor area, again, where design plays a very important role along with manufacturing, which will take a long time to catch up or never. So these kinds of sectors, using legitimate requirements for security, must actually scale the development of technologies in multiple ways on the shoulders of which others can stand. Another example is the space sector. With the new opening up of space to entrepreneurship in big ways, this will allow massive national industry to come up in these kinds of areas. They will have all sorts of impacts again on agri-tech and health and so on and so forth too. So quite optimistic, but I think we need to think in new ways from what we were thinking only 6 months ago.
What you're saying is that public procurement should be linked to some kind of a strategic focus.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we have talked about the state and talked about industry a bit. There is a lot of discussion about academia not being fully ready to contribute to this endeavor of creating good solutions and so on, because our own R&D intensity is fairly low. Research is good in some institutions, but not largely widespread. What do you think one should start with when it comes to academia, in terms of making it more research focused and more focused on developing technologies which are useful, if not in the immediate run, but short run?
We must keep in mind, as you point out, both the short run and the long run. And we must keep in mind that India is unusual. It's a France and a Germany in terms of tech and ability to do things, but it also combines in a salt and pepper mix extraordinarily deep social poverty issues which need to be addressed. This means that our R&D and our tech-dependent drive really comes from modest funding to a very small part of our population. 90% of our population goes to state universities, and 90% of our funding goes to central universities and laboratories. That situation needs to change. That, again, is not just a funding issue. The funding issue cannot be addressed, but it's a cultural issue. And the cultural issue comes from us being completely tied to looking at economic growth through technology as being anchored in a language of the West, specifically English. In other words, we are not anchoring our technological growth derived from questions in our population, but we're anchoring our technological growth on questions derived from the small France and Germany and aspire to be part of the world. This is not a winnable solution, right? China does not win its technological prowess, whatever different methods it might use. It has got a different approach to that, right? Germany or France has a different approach. It doesn't say that, Paris will be the place where all technology is and the rest of the economy will be an agricultural economy and we won't fund anything. America started the National Science Foundation to bring science to the smaller universities, the Midwestern universities, the Southern universities. And now you go to any American university, 1/3 of their faculty, even in the smallest of places, will be absolutely awesome. And they all contribute to the growth of Georgia as an aerospace sector, for example, and so on. So we must distribute our efforts nationally and in our languages, otherwise non-starter. So while we work on these short-term solutions, we must start off on the long term. And if they are long-term, all the more reason to start now.
You're right, absolutely right. When I was growing up, one could see very good people, not only in social sciences, but in sciences and technology in different parts of the country. They were very widely distributed. But over time, one has seen significant geographical concentration happening because of the unequal distribution of research resources, and people moved from smaller towns to Delhi and things like that. That, you're absolutely right, has to be reversed. But that means that these regional institutions will have to be good, and not only attract but retain people. As you're saying, the state universities in the US, some of them are top notch. They're as good as anybody else. But do you think that this idea of a good multidisciplinary university in each district would take us in that direction as a part of the new education policy?
Absolutely. The new education policy has a chapter on the National Research Foundation that will roll out soon, that aims to generate a set of mentors, people like you and others who will be supported generously to start their laboratories and research programs in smaller places, so that around them one can seed the growth of a research ethos in our college and university system. Given our young demography, it's an extraordinary opportunity. And there are many areas where instrumentation and big technology are important, but there are a huge number of areas where the question is far more demanding, far more of value in the solution rather than the instrument itself. So there are multiple ways we need to go, we can go ahead, but really the cultural change in our attitude, in other words, Atma Vishwas, as opposed to doubt about our capabilities, is something very important.
So, the other part of the NEP which I liked a lot was the focus on multidisciplinarity, which to my mind is very critical for whatever we're talking about, where you change technologies and use science and take solutions to the market, requires multiple disciplines. And we have created situations where institutions are more focused on specific areas, whether it is design or management or engineering. Do you think this transition would be easy for IITs to become multidisciplinary or IIMs to become multidisciplinary? It's very essential to do that and very critical for technology growth. But given our boundaries, what should be the best way to take that forward?
It's actually very, again, the answer is simple, the solution is complex. What is the demand that you put on an institution, right? And if you raise the demand, I don't mean from a top-down way, from a societal way. If you put the right kinds of demands, then the institution will deliver, right? If the demand on an institution is to solve a problem, right, then the institution will solve it. If the demand on an institution is to excel in different components of the means to solve that problem, but there's no demand to connect to solve a problem, the goal is not stated, then you will have a collection of extraordinary people who can in theory solve any problem if only they would work together. And again, one of the lessons from the pandemic is we spent too much time in the past exhausting people who have the means to come and work together. I think a little clear articulation of the goals of an institution will make them do that. For that, I think our institutions in our cities need to get together in an umbrella structure where there is an articulation of these goals. Within that umbrella, people do what they please, but there's an emerging property of a goal-driven structure without coercion, which can take. That happened best of places.
So this, I mean, even if we articulate our goals in a manner, we are saying that you need to solve a problem, and at the same time, we pursue an agenda of getting our universities among the top ranked universities in the world, which essentially is driven by research published in American journals. Do you see a conflict?
No, I don't see a conflict because, as I said, the outcome of focusing on a goal in an academic industry interface sector should be an emerging property of that interaction and not a narrowly orchestrated mechanism. Right? That can be done. That requires the building of an ecosystem. And the ecosystem in the city must make certain kinds of goals attractive and reasonable to implement. And it's a, feedback effect which amplifies that value of the goal. So you don't say, Ahmedabad must have a aerospace industry, right? That's not the way you do it. You get together the National Institute of Design, you get IIM, you get PRL, you get Ahmedabad University, in a manner where certain kinds of things become more and more enabling and more attractive for people to do. You have demands from the government, from industry, I want complex problems solved. And then things start happening. But that ecosystem of collegiality and interaction bottom up is needed just as much as a top-down articulation of a goal. Now, when you have that ecosystem, supposing you have, water supply or energy or an earthquake or disaster resilient infrastructure as a demand which needs to be solved in terms of either a societal demand or an industrial demand, people will come. They'll solve it.
I'm quite happy that you're saying it because I have been trying to say this for the last 10 years. And we have tried to do something of this kind in Ahmedabad by creating what we call an A-League of all the institutions. But institutional boundaries are very difficult to break. But anyway, one should keep at it. Let me ask a couple of other questions that I have here. One question says that the human spirit of experimentation has really blossomed in this pandemic. And you talked about that. How can this be sustained, or is it a one-time burst?
Well, why has such innovative effort come together during this pandemic? And that's because of an enormous investment in India and in countries around the world in fundamental training and research over many decades. The result of that is that is the only kind of research and effort which is agnostic to specific problems and therefore can solve any problem or at least have the best possible solution for a problem when it comes up. So this brings about, pandemic brought together people who are experts in droplets and aerosols and PPEs and ventilators and devices and epidemiology and mathematics, so on and so forth. But that's because you had a foundational training there. I know many people who are astronomers or mathematicians who went into modeling and did some very good work. So it's the foundational training which is important. And then when there's a demand, unfortunately, this demand is this kind of a crisis, but whatever kind of demand, people come together quite rapidly.
So last question, I think I can see the time. So one question is that our R&D spend as a percentage of GDP has stagnated around 0.7% for the past several years. With the government fiscally stretched, as also corporates, where do we find the money for R&D?
Well, it depends on what you see as the value for R&D. Now, there will be demands, of course, as there should be, in investment in other sectors, health, defense, agriculture, education, and so on and so forth. So to look at increasing investment in R&D in two wrong ways will cause problems. One wrong way is to expect only government direct investment to increase. Everywhere in the world, R&D, 70% of it is invested by the private sector for their own R&D. Indian private sector invests about 30-ish% for their own R&D.
Yeah.
And that private sector is really mostly public sector companies, right? So we have a challenge there. The second aspect of that investment is to look at R&D as something which is one R&D vertical, as opposed to every ministry, every department, every component needing R&D. So we are trying hard to dissolve both these two barriers so that R&D is looked at more favorably by industry because of this risk mitigation I told about in terms of partnership.
Right.
That will happen. And also looking at different ways by which we can have R&D impacting across different sectors of our society.
Okay. One question which I think everybody asks these days: when do you think a good COVID-19 vaccine will come out?
Well, one of the important points about science is you should never ask a yes or no question to a scientist. They will always tell you, given A, B, C, D, this is likely, right? Even when it's very likely, they will say that. And if it's unlikely, they will say, given A, B, C, D, it's unlikely. They will never say this will happen or that will happen. That's left to, I shouldn't use the term with you, the softer science.
Or astrologers, right? I mean, yeah.
But that said, there are extraordinarily positive signs in the way our immune system has dealt with the virus, which indicates a vaccine will be likely. There are extraordinary positive signs about the way early stage vaccine trials have shown that suggest that a vaccine will work. So, and there are many, many vaccines in the pipeline, about 3 of them in late stages. All likelihood, it looks like by the end of the year, there will be vaccines available. But that's only the beginning. You need to distribute them, and who you distribute them, how you distribute them, and so on will take some time. So till then, there are many things which we can do which are simple, which can actually even crush the pandemic. They're simple to state, sorry, they're hard to do. Mask yourselves, keep distance, and make sure that you're hygienic. All this will be transformative. It's not easy to do in many of our environments. In crowded areas, it's near impossible. But maximally, whatever it's possible, we should do. And we combine these with testing and tracking and tracing. We can, learn to have livelihood and health together while we wait for an exit visa.
So thank you very much, Vijay. It was a pleasure talking to you. And personally, I hope to meet you soon once again and talk about some of these issues and several others. I'll pass on the baton to Aditya to conclude the session. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Rakesh.
So thank you, Professor Basant. So for me personally, it's a great honor to deliver this vote of thanks today. In large part because I happen to be one of the people here who has had the opportunity of working directly with Prof. VijayRaghavan over the past couple of years. So I have sort of been a direct beneficiary of a lot of that wisdom and guidance that everyone has seen a glimpse of today. So on behalf of the IIMA Public Policy Alumni Special Interest Group, I thank Professor VijayRaghavan for his time spent with us today. So Prof actually leads a very extremely hectic schedule. So I saw that in my limited time with him, I saw that he covers topics like as diverse as quantum computing and molecular biology to future of transport and technology commercialization. So a number of topics keep going on in his daily schedule. So we are really grateful that he considered IIMA and our community as worthy of fitting into this schedule. So thank you so much, Professor. I would also like to thank my former professor, Professor Rakesh Basant, who did this great job of hosting our webinar and guiding it so well. So, in fact, even Prof. Basant, for all the people who have been involved with IIMA, everyone knows that Prof. Basant's interest and work in fields of innovation, economics, entrepreneurship through CII and otherwise, they are well known to everyone in the IIMA community. I would just quickly attempt to, a vain attempt to just in a couple of minutes summarize whatever all the broad topics which we covered today, even though it's not really possible given the depth and the breadth of topics. But just in a couple of minutes for the purpose of the closing remarks. So we started off with a very beautiful big history style narrative of how life on Earth itself evolved. Coming to the boundary conditions existing till December 2019, when the world was very different from what it is today. And then we came to this sudden shock of the pandemic and how it disrupted the entire system in which the world had been functioning, and the boundary conditions themselves got changed. And in these conditions, we saw how science and technology have actually increased their scope and effectiveness. So for example, Prof talked about the power of data and how big data is only going to become even more important. It's not going to go away. For example, our entire manufacturing, which earlier relied on cost and labor arbitrage, will go to the sites where they're actually being used. And the supply chain itself, we need a lot more data to just function. So the power of data is just going to increase. And then, of course, Prof talked about how it's important for us to take advantage of this new importance of data and not be on the receiving end of it. We talked about how state support is definitely important to counter market failures in order to promote innovation in some core areas like agriculture, infrastructure, etc. And then we also we talked about some key lessons which the pandemic has brought to the fore. For example, the diagnostic of a human for an illness, for an animal, or for an industry, fundamental premises remain quite the same. So there's this enormous opportunity to grasp this so-called middle area in all these different systems, so that, and our research institutes actually have an opportunity to grasp and develop their capabilities by making use of these new opportunities which are coming up. Then we came to a very important topic about whether we will go back to the old way of doing things, or we'll actually take advantage of this disruption to go to a better way of doing things. So Prof mentioned how the value of working together has been demonstrated in this pandemic situation. And it's only through a combination of efforts from various disciplines that we will be able to adapt to a new way of doing things. Otherwise, as we have seen through a number of previous shocks, memory is very short term, and we have a huge chance of going back to an old way of doing things. And in fact, a very important term, interesting term, which Prof mentioned, is this de-addiction from frugal but really high-tech goods. This unfortunate addiction which we have got due to prominence of China and global value chains and elites getting access to good sub-quality goods at a very cheap price, which is not very natural. So this addiction to the phone itself is not bad, but can we pay for that phone in a way that we also cover the costs to the environment, to the planet? Is that sustainable? So that clearly is not. We talked about something, a politics resistant science policy, which is a question which a lot of people pose. In fact, I have myself posed this question to Prof earlier. And so again, so Prof gave on the answer that, this thinking stems from a rooted thinking that politics is inherently bad, which is not so. And if every layer of the pyramid which is working towards the public good is robust, then there is a middle ground where we can have policies which are long term but are still resistant to any short term fluctuations in political environments and all. Towards the end, we came to a very important topic for IIMA, so to say, the importance of academia. So how can academia strengthen research? So there was this discussion of how 90% of our population goes to state universities, but our resources, 90% go to central universities. So it all being a cultural issue about how we are anchoring our beliefs about progress to questions derived from the West and not from ourselves. And China and the US and a lot of leading countries have actually not done this. They have come out with, for example, the National Science Foundation in the US, which have enabled small universities to boost their research outputs. and so on. And then we ended with a discussion of the new new educational policy, and how multidisciplinarity, which Professor Basant focused on, is going to solve a number of our problems and help us articulate our problems better. So Prof mentioned that along with this top-down goal setting, we also need an ecosystem of bottom-up capacity building in our institutions. And if we approach the importance of multidisciplinarity is simply this, as per the discussion which we saw today. If the demand on an institution is to solve a problem, then the institution works towards solving the problem. But if the demand is simply to build capabilities to solve different parts of the problem without an end problem in mind, then we have people who can theoretically solve the entire problem, parts of the problem, but we don't have a focus on the problem itself. So, and of course, we also covered through a question, a very interesting question about the importance of R&D investments. So as Prof mentioned to us that we should not look at R&D investment growth in wrong ways. For example, expecting only the government to invest in R&D, or look at R&D as a separate standalone vertical and not something which is a part of each vertical around us. And of course, we ended with a question on the COVID vaccine, and Prof mentioned that there are positive signs of our immune system dealing with this virus, and a vaccine may come out by the end of this year. But also then starts the distribution effort. So in the meantime, we have our responsibility to crush this pandemic as much as possible through personal efforts and through community efforts of safety, testing, diagnostic, etc. So it was all in all a very rich discussion, and the Public Policy Alumni Special Interest Group will distill all these observations and discussions and highlight, and all the highlights discussed today. We will circulate a summary note on the discussion. So in the end, I would like to also thank the audience who joined us for the session. We had close to 100 active participants on Zoom and also on YouTube, a few of them. Many thought-provoking questions came in. Like every time, we would like to thank Prof. Anish Sugathan, who has been the faculty guide for our alumni SIG, and the alumni and the IIMA alumni office itself, led by Anurag Choudhury, for extending all possible support to our alumni SIG. Last but not the least, the alumni SIG itself, the coordinators, Akhilesh Tilotia, Suhail Qasim, all the alumni members. Special mention to Vidhi Desai for being an integral part of our efforts. We are now looking forward to the next webinar in our series with Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, who is the Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, next Saturday on the 22nd of August. For the time being, I wish everyone a very happy Independence Day and a very happy weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.